This will be the first thing you see.
No, no.
Oh, now I gotta start it. Okay, I'm gonna start it.
Okay. Pull up that on here.
I was literally eating that. I know. I was going to put them in the fridge.
President Truman, please.
That's not going over the
Oh, I had it turned out. There's a door open over there. Are y'all done or? Oh. This
Hello.
He'll be with you in just 1 minute, Mr. President.
All right.
Hello.
Hello, Miss Harry Truman.
Hello, how are you, Mr. President?
Well, I'm all right, and I'm just pleased to death the way these things came out.
Well, we'll just stay at it, and I just wanted to bring you up to date on it. We got a letter from him on Friday night, which was rather conciliatory on these withdrawals. Then on Saturday morning, 12 hours after the other letters received, we got this entirely different letter about the missile bases in Turkey.
That's the way to do things.
Then, then we rejected that. Then they came back with and accepted the earlier proposal. So I think we're going to have a lot of difficulties, but at least we made some progress about getting these missiles out of there. And in addition, I think that Khrushchev's had some difficulties in maintaining his position. My judgment is that it's going to make things tougher in Berlin because the fact he's had something of a setback in Cuba is going to make him
That's right.
rougher in Berlin. But at least it's a little better than it was a couple of days ago.
Well, you're on the right track. You just keep after them. That's the language they understand, is what you give.
All right, good.
You've been asking me for comments until the President of the United States, and we'll man can comment on it.
All right. Okay. Good. Take care. I'll be in touch with you.
All right.
Thank you, Mr.
I
President.
certainly appreciate the call.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. Bye-bye.
Okay, here we are again. Finally, a week late. Ides of May.
Well,
We-
it was May 15th was the Ides. It was
Yeah.
about 7 days.
It's one of the.
6 days.
It's May is one of the 4 months of the year where the Ides falls on the 15th.
Right.
When the other months they fall on the 13th. So, Ides of Apocalypse is our name, and we chose that because it's two words that have kind of been corrupted, and
Right. Neither
inverted.
one that is bad. Ides
they're
was,
actually good words.
Ides was is celebration, and Apocalypse was revealings and revelation.
Unveiling, and apocalypse is something that happens within you too. Kind of like jihad has been misconstrued. It's not a physical battle
Right.
against people. Jihad is the battle
Spiritual
inside
battle.
yourself, and that's the same thing with apocalypse. You're praying for discernment and trying to see the world the way it
Right.
really is, and not what you're being told. So we've got this one. It's World War II and nostalgia, and
The Truman Show.
the Truman Show, and it's not the actor that's kind of lost his marbles.
Right.
It's about President Truman.
Yeah, we were thinking about the Truman Show and how far it goes back, and then it occurred to me that we had a president named Truman, and so
the
our
33rd president, which
30.
some people will find that interesting.
in
It's just kind of
numerology, yeah.
just kind of neat.
But we think a lot of what came out of after World War II, like
Yeah.
the CIA, the UN, the NSA, there's a lot of agencies that came and were established after.
And there are foundations that start going back to 1913. People know
Right.
what 1913 is, Jekyll Island, and World War I and stuff, and that laid groundwork. But World War II was the catalyst that
Right.
changed
And
so
Harry
much.
Truman's administration was the one that kind of codified all these agencies. And
Mm-hmm.
so what we want to show is that, this we are living in a kind of Truman Show, and it goes all the way back to Harry Truman, and we're going to tell you why we think that, on top of going on the topic
We're
of
gonna-
nostalgia.
Yeah.
Because we did a prior stream about the one.
Late last year, we did nostalgia, which was it's very interesting. We'll get into that later.
Right.
But Harry Truman, he's this no-nonsense Midwestern guy. He's the accidental president,
Right.
because Roosevelt picked him in '44 for his running mate, and
And he was like 3 months into Roosevelt.
Yeah.
term when Roosevelt died and he took over. So just to kind of get us started on the Truman Show, the Harry S. Truman Show, I was going to read you just a little bit of this New Yorker article that was written actually this year, strangely enough,
Yeah.
in March of this year. The title of it is Harry Truman Helped Make Our World Order for Better and for Worse.
Which it's like that's a nice contradiction.
Yeah, right below that title it says institutions meant to secure peace from NATO to the UN date back to Truman's presidency. So do the conflicts threatening that peace. So, Americans today seem to believe that we live in an especially exhausting political times, but the rhythms of our moment, pandemic, protest, pandemic, election, insurrection, pandemic, invasion of Ukraine, have nothing on the Truman era. Between April 1945, when Franklin D. Roosevelt's death thrust Harry S. Truman into office, and January 1953, when Truman handed the presidency to Dwight D. Eisenhower, the war in Europe ended. Hitler killed himself, and the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The Cold War began. The State of Israel came into being. The Soviet Union developed its own nuclear weapons. China underwent a communist revolution. The West created NATO. The world created the United Nations, and the Korean War began. One could go on. How much Truman shaped these events and how much he was buffeted by them is the puzzle at the heart of Jeffrey Frank's new book, The Trials of Harry S. Truman.
The Trials.
The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man, 1945 to 1953. Truman was the ultimate accidental president, a pipsqueak senator from Independence, Missouri,
Pipsqueak. I love that.
who had been vice president for less than 3 months when Roosevelt died. Once Truman assumed office, global events seemed to proceed according to their own logic and momentum. Truman inherited daunting challenges, and he borrowed other men's visions in order to meet them. His own accomplishments occurred somewhere in between. Maybe I should throw in
Would
that
this be considered good writing though, or would it be good for like a?
it was a dark and stormy night.
Yeah.
Lou and I have this theory about presidents. We might talk about this in
Yeah.
the stream, that the president.
Secretaries of State.
We don't really believe that the presidents have the power. We know that Biden is not running things, right? So who has the power?
But that goes for both sides of the aisle. And then what we're kind of developing this little hypothesis that the Secretaries of State actually run the show
Right.
here, and of course they answer to somebody else too.
Secretaries of State, Secretaries of Treasury,
But not in every instance.
Right.
We're still trying to
figure
work
out
through this
who the hand behind
because
it
we
is.
definitely think that Kissinger, I think ran Nixon, so that's a big one.
Yeah.
But
So keep that in mind as I continue reading.
yeah.
Truman acknowledged that he didn't have much choice about whether to drop the bomb. As a practical matter, Frank notes the decision had been made for him.
And he puts this in quotes, but there's no
Right.
who made the decision.
Right.
So he just, in this article, it just kind of goes through, but it doesn't ever say, well, then who made the decision?
Right. Truman's greatest foreign policy triumph, the European Recovery Program, is credited to the military giant and Secretary of State, George Marshall.
We're going to talk about him too.
We don't call it the Truman Plan. If you remember, that was
Yeah,
called
the Marshall Plan.
Marshall Plan. As President Truman was accused of losing China, but China was, of course, never really his to lose. And it was Senator Joseph McCarthy, more than Truman, who defined the political tenor of the era. Perhaps Truman's most significant act as president was his decision to enter and then stick with the war in Korea. Although that conflict was never the political disaster that Vietnam turned out to be, it killed millions, often with shocking brutality. The South was effectively recaptured in the first few months. The long, blood-drenched impasse that ensued accomplished little. On the home front, Truman's dream of achieving universal health care languished as well. After a bruising battle with the American Medical Association and the Republican Party, he ended up more or less where he started.
Yeah.
So, in this article, the New Yorker, they tell you it wasn't his decision,
Yeah.
and I don't know what they mean by that. I assume they mean that, well, he had to do it because he was saving lives, but
Yeah.
you're supposed to infer that. But what I infer from it is it wasn't his decision to make because it was like the Secretary of State or whoever's actually running things. And they call him the accidental president if you read his background and where he came from, you know,
Independence, Missouri.
Independence, Missouri. He ran a haberdashery for like 3 years. It wasn't successful.
He was a dandy, and he failed at that.
It shut down. I think he went on to become a senator. It kind of reminds me of Obama's, except Obama didn't even run. You know, even
He was always unopposed because they.
I just mean he didn't even run at least this dude had a
Yeah.
business for 3 years. He didn't even run a business.
Well, he has one over Obama. He ran a campaign that was successful.
Right.
That was maybe legitimate because he
Maybe.
actually had opponents.
Yeah. He, the way Wikipedia describes him, he won a surprise victory against Republican Thomas E. Dewey that secured his own presidential term. He established both the Truman Doctrine, which the Truman Doctrine had to do with
containing communism and saying, okay,
Right.
this is it.
and
gonna stop.
we're still at war with the
Yeah.
Russians,
Mhm.
and NATO to contain the expansion of communism. He presided over the onset of the Cold War in 1947, and I thought this was interesting. I read Wikipedia to read between the lines, or a lot of times
Well, even to see what they brag about,
right.
you can see what.
Yeah. So they said the Cold War was characterized by a lack of global hot wars. Instead, there were proxy wars. Ukraine, fought by client states and proxies of the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1951, the United States ratified the 22nd Amendment, making a president ineligible for a third term or for election to a second term after having served more than 2 years of a term of a previously elected president. But of course he was not.
He was grandfathered in.
And he thought about running. If he had been popular enough to do it, he would have done it. He decided.
Well, and we can get into the article we read earlier today that later maybe he didn't run because people would have found out what a crook he was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Also, I thought something interesting. I didn't catch all of this. I didn't get that whole printout. But when he dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and
Nagasaki.
So 125,000 were killed in Hiroshima and 125,000.
Yeah.
So it's such a nice even number to bring you to. 500,000 Allied casualties. Critics have argued that the use of I like how we. Oh, let me just read it and then I'll say. Critics have argued that the use of nuclear weapons was unnecessary.
Oh yeah, I'll be right back. You keep going.
All right. Given that conventional attacks or a demonstrative bombing of an uninhabited area might have forced Japan's surrender, and therefore assert that the attack constituted a crime of war. So for whatever reason, it's Lou and mine's belief that they have to tell you the truth, and they spell it out right there. Critics have argued that the use of nuclear weapons was unnecessary. It is my belief that it was unnecessary, but that's a topic for another time. The end of World War II was followed by an uneasy transition from war to a peacetime economy. So I want you to think about foreign aid. After World War II and Truman's presidency is when foreign aid really got codified. The war machine, there's a lot of money in war. So when war ended, you're supposed to, they should have winded down all those, agencies and war machine that.
Yeah, you're talking about the spending and stuff.
Yeah, and so at the end of World War II, supposedly Truman, he was actually on a committee when FDR was president to start kind of winding down things. It's my belief that it did the opposite. What they did is they explored ways that they could
transfer the spending.
Redirect those funds. So the cost of the war effort had been enormous, and Truman was intent on diminishing military services as quickly as possible to curtail the government's military expenditures. The effect of demobilization on the economy was unknown. Proposals were met with skepticism and resistance, and fears existed that the nation would slide back into a depression. So if you think about the hands the brains behind the presidency going on back then, and all the money that was flowing. It's the same thing that's going on now with the end of the Afghanistan war, and then what's being reignited in Ukraine, and all that money that's being spent. It's like it would take an act of God to shut that down. Nobody ever wants to stop the flow of that money. But this all started, legally under the Truman Show. When a national rail
and stop there. With Truman, there's so many things that came out of World War II, and you've got NATO, NASA, all these other organizations, and you've got Ike in there too. And Ike comes after Truman as president, but Operation Overcast, which became Operation Paperclip.
Right.
And a lot of people know what Operation Paperclip was bringing all these Nazi scientists over, especially rocketry. But they brought over medical people too, so who knows how much of our federal health service was indoctrinated with Nazi scientists with that.
Right.
But Ike was in charge of all that stuff, so there's a transition, and supposedly it went from Democrat to Republican when Ike was elected.
Right.
But it was the same show.
Right.
Groundwork laid with Roosevelt for sure, with all the shit he did for what did he have? 14 years. He had he was elected four terms, but he didn't finish out. He died.
Only started 3 months into the last term.
So just over 12 years of Roosevelt.
Right.
But it coincides with all this stuff at NASA and everything that forms under Ike.
Right. Yeah, the guy that supposedly warned us about
He warned us.
the military-industrial
He
complex.
was in charge the whole time it was building up.
Well, he was the very first Allied Supreme Commander of NATO.
Yeah.
Who appointed him? That was that.
That would have been Truman.
Truman appointed him to that. And NATO was created. So think about NATO and their role right now in the Ukraine. Everybody talks about them like they're this defensive thing to protect, their allies and stuff. No, it seems like they've been instigating this
for a while, and especially with Russia, it goes. Russia was expressing concerns about NATO back in the late '90s.
Right.
But it got even worse after that, and it's not. NATO's supposed to be a defensive treaty.
Right.
A pact. You attack one, you attack all of us, but they keep expanding towards Russia.
Right.
And don't Russia may not be the best player on the field either, but they've been telling them for years.
We've been at
stop
this since since 1947 or before. Congress passed the Presidential Succession Act of 1947, which replaced the Secretary of State with the Speaker of the House, and the President pro tempore of the Senate as the successor to the President after the Vice President. So I did not know this, but before the Speaker of the House was third in line, it was the Secretary of State. And that actually got changed in 1886.
Yeah.
So our contention, and we
started talking about this last week.
Right, and we'd come to the conclusion that everybody knows Biden's not in charge, but who's in charge? And so you think about your secretaries of state, like Hillary Clinton was Obama's secretary
for the
of state.
first 4 to 6 years.
Yeah, and so I was thinking, she wanted to be president, and actually they wanted to be president, but just like with Kamala, when they put her out there, and that's who they wanted to be president, but then she couldn't garner the public support, so they couldn't create the illusion that we could elect Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris. So they come to Hillary and they say, okay, you're not that popular, you're not going to get elected. So they promise her they'll make her Secretary of State, which we're guessing the Secretary of State has more power in the presidency.
And not every occasion. It's
not
every Secretary of State, but it seems to me that, and like I said earlier, I think maybe that Kissinger was the one running the show during the Nixon presidency.
Well, you'll see
because Nixon came out of World War II. World War II, Nixon was Kissinger. He was a private in the army.
Right.
And as they were rolling through Germany and occupying German towns, in late '44, early '45. Kissinger was in charge of whole German towns as a private in the U.S. Army. He was the guy running
as
these towns.
a private, so that
Yeah.
tells you
And
something's
so
up
he was
there.
being groomed for something.
Right.
And that whole China thing with Nixon seems to me like being run by somebody else. And I think Nixon probably, didn't even realize.
Well, he didn't realize. I think a lot of these people, it's like, I don't know if Trump realized. I don't, did Bill Clinton realize? Who knows?
And with Trump, who was his first Secretary of State? It was Mike Pompeo.
Yeah, Mike Pompeo.
Came about. Mike
It was
Pompeo.
after. Who did he? I forget who was first.
But Pompeo comes from CIA, Secretary of State.
He's so bad.
And I was like, was that like a last minute move to corral
Right,
some
and now
actions?
they're going to try to run him for president. But, okay, so Truman supported Roosevelt's policy in favor of the creation of the United Nations, and so he did attend that ceremony. United Nations was created under Truman's term. Although he had little personal experience on foreign matters, Truman listened closely to his top advisors, especially George Marshall and Dean Acheson. And both of those two characters they were involved in that administration and several
Roosevelt.
others.
And you think about George Marshall too, is he was Army Chief of Staff during World War II. I just wonder if he was running Roosevelt during World War II. And
Right.
you come out and also you get the Marshall Plan instead of the Truman Plan.
Right.
It's not named after the president. It's named after the Secretary of State.
Right.
And then I didn't realize that he was also Secretary of Defense for a while.
Yeah, I didn't
Which,
either.
Secretary of Defense, it was named the Defense Department, but through World War II, it was called the War Department
yeah.
from the beginning.
I've got that in here. I'm fixing to go into that.
Okay.
So, although I read that. The Republicans controlled Congress in 1947 and 1948, so he worked with their leaders, especially Senator Arthur H. Vandenberg, chairman of the powerful Foreign Relations Committee. The Foreign Relations Committee is a very powerful committee.
Yeah.
That one in the Senate Intel.
He's got an Air Force base named after him.
Yeah. He won bipartisanship support for both the Truman Doctrine, which formalized a policy of Soviet containment, and the Marshall Plan, which aimed to help rebuild post-war Europe. Okay, I want to read that again while you think about what is the definition of foreign aid, which aimed to help rebuild post-war Europe. That's where foreign aid started.
Yeah.
And so that and it was a lot of money if you look at the numbers. Even back then, it was a buttload of money. And so over time, that has to change to whatever is their favorite, pet project, whatever is that foreign aid. They attach it to something that they can sell you to the public, but basically it's just going back into the hands of the swamp.
Yeah.
Their friends, contractors, bureaucrats, to get Congress to spend the vast sums necessary to restart.
Vast.
Yeah, the moribund European economy. Truman used an ideological argument, arguing that communism flourishes in economically deprived areas. As part of the U.S. Cold War strategy, Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 and reorganized military forces by merging the Department of War and the Department of Navy into the National Military Establishment, later the Department of Defense. So basically they changed National Military Establishment.
Well, and when he argues that communism flourishes in economically deprived areas, I would say that communism thrives in very vibrant economic areas that are morally decadent.
Right. It's the opposite.
The way the U.S. is right now.
Yeah.
And the way Russia was in 1917, 1918.
Yeah.
It was actually a booming economy, but even before World War I, Russia had one of the strongest economies in the world.
Yeah.
And they had to, but it was corrupt. It was morally corrupt.
Right. The act also created the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and the National Security Council. In 1952, Truman secretly consolidated and empowered the cryptologic elements of the United States by creating the National Security Agency. So all these things, the NSA, the CIA, the
NASA.
DoD, which was basically the
Yeah.
war, the War Department, the UN. From 1947 until 1989, world affairs was dominated by the Cold War, in which the U.S. and its allies faced the Soviet Union and
And I
its
love
allies.
they call it the Cold War, but how many millions died through these decades?
They call it a
in all these
Cold
proxies
War,
war.
yeah.
Because we weren't at war, but all these proxy wars, millions of people still died. They
Right.
they changed terms.
Well, it's just like the War of Iraq. Where we
Yeah.
over there, we got to fight them over there. So we don't.
Yeah.
A lot of people. There was no large-scale fighting, but instead several local civil wars, as well as the ever-present threat of a catastrophic nuclear war. So, unlike Roosevelt, Truman distrusted Stalin. The final break came in 1947 when the Labour government in London could no longer afford to help Greece fight communism and asked Washington to assume responsibility for suppressing the communist uprising there. The result was the Truman Doctrine of 1947 and 1948, which made it national policy to contain communist expression. Think foreign aid.
Yeah.
That it made that national policy. In 1948, the Washington enacted the Marshall Plan, which supplied Western Europe, including Germany, with U.S. $13 billion in reconstruction aid. So I don't know what $13 billion would be adjusted for inflation.
It would be a lot. It would be, but billions already a big number. So
Right. The main diplomatic initiative was the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, committing the United States to nuclear defense of Western Europe. The result was a peace in Europe coupled with the fear of Soviet invasion and a reliance on American protection. The United States operated a worldwide network of bases for its Army, Navy, and Air Force, with large contingents stationed in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. Washington had a weak intelligence community before 1942, and the Soviets had a very effective network of spies. The solution was to create the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. Economic and propaganda warfare against the communist world became part of the American toolbox. So, economic and propaganda warfare against the communist world. But at what point did they start using that propaganda against us?
I think from the very beginning.
Also, the Air Force was created during the Truman's.
Yeah, and the Air Force it's broken away from the Army because it was the Army Air Corps during the.
They seem to
during
be the
war.
most ahead, like on social pronoun, like.
Air Force also has usually the best golf courses of any armed forces segment.
That's
And
nice.
They're like a lot of, especially Navy and Army, they love to make fun of the Air Force.
Right, they do.
And they're airmen.
Perhaps the most powerful person in. I don't know why I had this. I was going on to different people. Calvin, I'll just do this. Calvin Coolidge, who was president in 1923,
Yeah.
I forget when he took
He was in the
office.
lead up to the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And supposedly, I think part of what Roosevelt, when he won election,
Right.
it was to
And I-
blame the other party.
Everything that I can read about him, like my discernment tells me, like maybe he was a decent guy.
Yeah.
But the most powerful person in Calvin Coolidge's cabinet was the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who controlled the administration's financial policies and was regarded by many, including House Minority Leader John Nance Garner, as more powerful than Coolidge himself.
Well, he was a banker, Mellon.
Yeah, so I know this is unrelated to what I was talking about, but it goes to the idea that the president doesn't have the power, and this goes way back. Like even with Woodrow Wilson, his campaign slogan when he ran for his second term was he kept us out of war.
Yeah.
And then he
And
got
what did he
elected,
do?
and 1 month after he got elected, we're going to.
Yeah.
They sank the Lusitania.
So, and then our little hypothesis we have about secretaries of state, it's not every one of them.
Right.
We don't think.
Because sometimes
But
it's,
even with that,
But it's always somebody, like the
Yeah.
Secretary of Treasury or the Chief
or I
of
think
Staff.
with Roosevelt, it might have been Marshall while he was Army
Yeah.
Chief of Staff, and then he became Secretary of State
Right.
with Truman. So even with the Secretary of State being like, I'm thinking maybe Hillary was running the show with Obama
Right. Yeah.
because she's really
We think Hillary was running when Bill Clinton was in there.
yeah. But even then, she still answers to somebody that we don't know.
Oh yeah, yeah. So Truman and Eisenhower, they shared a lot of the same. I think they had the same Secretary of State.
Well, there was an overlap.
Yeah. He also upgraded the role of National Security Council in planning all the phases of the Cold War.
Well, and that's where you get the National Security Advisor.
So
too.
but I think it's interesting the way they word that, in planning all the phases of, like, they knew,
Yeah.
and they'll say, oh, well, we defeated the Russians. Like, maybe y'all just create, like how they're doing now, where they're framing the Russians as bad and the Ukrainians good, and we know that that's not true. So Eisenhower was after Truman. I just thought this was interesting. It's also unrelated, but Eisenhower considered himself, his philosophy was of dynamic conservatism. He was a progressive conservative.
Right.
You know, George Bush was
compassionate.
passionate.
George H.W. And I'm like, why do you have to categorize or emphasize compassionate?
Conservative. Does that mean conservatism by itself is not
Right.
compassionate? Okay, I'm not going in any specific order, but JFK, Dean Acheson took the lead in recommending a military buildup alongside NATO allies. So was Dean Acheson his Secretary of State? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think so.
But Dean Acheson
With
was in
Kennedy.
several. So was
Administrations. Well, and there's always overlap between both parties. There's always overlap.
right.
And so, what we're trying to bring together in this whole thing is that World War II was a huge catalyst, and there was foundations going back to 1913, like we said, and World War I and things that happened. But World War II was such a huge like a game changer.
It was so huge.
Yeah, we looked at in one episode that we did a year or two ago we looked at the Richard Nixon stuff again with Watergate.
Yeah.
And in my research in that, I found
Alexander Haig or Kissinger.
No, his vice president. I'm brain farting.
Nixon's vice. George Shultz. I know.
No. He played football at Michigan. I mean, I'm brain farting.
I can't think of his name. Oh my God.
President.
Hold on.
How am I brain farting on that?
Nixon, vice
VP.
president. Jeez, man. And we both do it at the same time. Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, before World War II, was an American, and people might not know this, but America First actually came from Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh.
Right.
Big organization, huge rallies, and a lot of people.
Think like Trump. Like, there was huge
pre-World War
rallies.
pre-World War II, there were a lot of people, and pre-World War II for us is we're 41. It started in 39, so for the 2 years prior, there are a lot of rallies going on, and
Right.
Gerald Ford was a part of America First,
Started out.
and
yeah.
and they were like anti. That's their war. Let them have that. That's not our fight.
Right.
But Gerald Ford, I think it's the Army. He goes into the Pacific, serves through the term, and then he through the war, and he comes out. He's
Changed.
all about internationalist and
Globalists.
neocon type shit. And so that's a crucial one. But how many people's minds were changed? And it took. We did another episode a few months ago where we talked about the Office of War Information, and I didn't realize this till we started looking into it. Roosevelt put this office. He signed an executive order to create this office in 42, like a week before the Battle of Midway, because the American public was not behind this war.
Right.
They were not supportive of the allies that we had, and
Even
the story.
after Pearl Harbor.
The story that the narrative we've always been given from coming from out of World War II
Right.
is America was against the war. We were isolationists, but Pearl Harbor galvanized the nation, and we were all in support.
Right.
Well,
No.
6-7 months later, the president Roosevelt felt a need to create an office that would corral information and do propaganda, basically, to convince the American public that we were doing the right thing, because it still wasn't being supported.
Right.
And so that narrative kind of gets
Speaking
blown
of
up
that-
too. And with that, all the major Hollywood studios agreed to let this Office of War Information preview their scripts before they put their movies out, and all of them except Paramount. Still
Yeah.
haven't found out the reason for that. Is
Yeah.
why all of them at Paramount agreed to that. But
Right.
every movie made during World War II, no matter if it was about the war or not, was pre-screened by Roosevelt's administration.
While we're on the topic of World War II, I left out something I wanted to cover with Truman. Okay, Truman, you remember, ran against Dewey,
Yeah.
and there's the big moment,
Oh yeah,
in
we
the-
should definitely cover
the
that.
election where
The Chicago
the
Tribune.
newspaper, the Chicago Tribune prints the newspaper. Dewey defeats Truman, and then you got that picture of
Of Truman holding the thing up because he's the one that's won.
right. And so Lou and I did. I can't remember the scope we did where we touched on this topic where we wonder what did Dewey actually defeat Truman? Like maybe that was a stolen election, but just listen to this. Something about Dewey. Dewey had considered, as he was campaigning, he had considered including the conspiracy theory that Roosevelt,
Oh, he was telling us, Leonard. Hey, Leonard, I'm sorry I didn't see that.
after Agnew was, sorry, I should have been looking at comments.
Yeah.
After Agnew was forced to resign. Oh yeah, Agnew. I forgot about Agnew
Yeah.
having to resign.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really even know why Agnew had to resign. Do you?
I think it was manufactured, kind of. There was
Yeah.
like financial shenanigans or something, maybe.
Right.
Who knows? They're all corrupt no
Yeah.
matter what.
But anyway, Dewey was a New York politician. I think he was governor of New York. He was high up.
He was a governor.
So he wasn't this like America First, or he's like somebody that we could just get behind. But there is this little tidbit that makes me think that Dewey actually won, and this is the reason he didn't. Dewey had considered including the conspiracy theory that Roosevelt knew about the attacks on Pearl Harbor beforehand and allowed it to happen, and to say, and instead of being reelected, he should be impeached. The allegation would have suggested the then secret fact that the U.S. had broken the Purple Code still in use by the Japanese military. Dewey eventually yielded to Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall in urging not to touch this topic. Marshall informed Harry Hopkins of his action in late October this year. Hopkins then told the president, Roosevelt, reasoned that Dewey would not, for political purposes, give secret and vital information to the enemy. And so I was just talking to Lou before we got started. So he would not disclose secret and, for political purposes, vital information. How is that giving information to the enemy that says Roosevelt knew about those Pearl Harbor attacks before they happened, which we know now he did?
Well, and this election is after the war.
Right. So during the campaign in a first, Roosevelt provided Dewey with information on the war
Well,
efforts.
okay, so this was still during the war, and then
No.
such as
On the war efforts, such
Yeah.
as the breaking of Japanese naval code. This was the first time that an oppositional presidential candidate was given briefings by the incumbent presidential administration. And so I wonder, did they make Dewey think he was going to be president? Because that never happened. They'd never given.
and they kind of set him up.
And so why would,
So we can go into. There was an article. I ran into an interview with the publisher of the Chicago Tribune from I can't remember what the year this was, but they were talking basically, and like when newspapers get things wrong now, they still double down. They still say,
Yeah.
"Oh, we're still not wrong.
like Brian
You're just
Stelter.
you're just
It's like,
you're just
you don't-
not
You're just not smart enough to know.
yeah, you're just not. You can't interpret it right." And so this publisher of the Chicago Tribune was basically defending the fact that they put this newspaper out that's saying Dewey defeats Truman.
Right.
And so it's kind of interesting, and there's some arrogance in here. But this guy interviewing said during the 40-day presidential campaign, the press had to deal with extraordinary. Oh wait, no. Oh, I can't see it all.
Oh,
You
sure.
know what? I'm gonna go to the article.
All right.
They'll still see us. So, the person interviewing this man at the Tribune. I go back up just a little bit. Oh, it's down.
It's down at the bottom. Oh, sorry.
Because I screenshot it, but it's the way the format's kind of hiding some of it. Oh, we're
It's
close.
right.
We're close right here.
Sorry.
So,
It's right.
come on. Yeah, here we go. So this man asked Maloney, who was the publisher of the Tribune. He was responsible for the headline that day. But the headline, Dewey defeats Truman, might leave some readers with the mistaken impression that Thomas Dewey won the presidential election of '48, which was not true then, is not true now. So here's Maloney. During the '48 presidential campaign, the press had to deal with extraordinary circumstances of both major party candidates defeating each other. For instance, Dewey defeated Truman in Indiana, while Truman defeated Dewey in the presidential election. Coverage of both outcomes was justified as news. We understand, and this is gold. We understand that readers often see political coverage through, no surprise, their own political lens. And we thank God every day that as journalists, and this is the gold, we had our political lenses surgically removed.
Right.
So
That sounds just
Just-
like Brian Stelter.
as a stupid, if you go with basic science, how did you prove that? Our job is to work hard to make our coverage appear to come from an objective news perspective. And I was telling Yvonne earlier before we started, if you had your political lens surgically removed, you would not have to work hard to appear to be objective.
Right.
So to do that, we are constantly asking ourselves the following questions. And and we're going to get into nostalgia here in a bit.
Yeah.
And how nostalgia can be a good thing and a bad thing.
Right.
And about the root of the word and where it came from. And you're remembering, some people actually still tweet, man, I remember the days of Walter Cronkite and the news
Yeah.
was just the news. Well, it never was.
It never was.
Because news is the word itself. We ought to look at the etymology of that itself.
Yeah.
So to do that, we are constantly asking ourselves the following questions, usually in a sing-songy voice. There's
thinking
arrogance in this sentence.
Scary Poppins,
Yeah.
the Ministry of
God.
Information.
There's a sing-songy voice. What is important for readers to know? Okay, well, they're deciding that.
Right.
Do our readers treat this noble institution with enough deference
Noble.
and respect?
This
Who-
noble institution,
Yeah.
that's the premise. You have to believe that this is a noble institution.
Yeah, but what is important for readers to know?
With enough
and do our readers
deference.
and respect. So who won the presidential election of 1948? Who's to say what's true anymore anyway, This is the
Who's
the
to say what's
and now,
true?
And looking back, the guy that owned the Chicago Tribune at the time was a huge anti-FDR dude.
Sears
He couldn't stand him.
Henning.
Well, no, that was the
That's the
Capitol, not the owner. I'm talking about the owner.
Oh, okay. He
of
was the
newspaper.
Washington correspondent. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then this guy asked, "Do you worry that Dewey supporters will go around for years to come, citing the Chicago Tribune to claim that Thomas Dewey won the presidential election of 1948, or that Dewey himself might keep repeating the phrase Dewey defeats Trump anytime he sees a microphone?"
Dewey defeats
Dewey-
Truman.
I mean, Truman.
Every time I was reading today, I kept saying Trump.
So insist that everyone address him as President Dewey, and eventually set up some kind of fascist shadow government for his drooling white nationalist followers. And Maloney goes, "That doesn't sound like the Republican Party I know." Did you miss the part where Strom Thurmond was in the race?
It's the same
It's-
storyline and
And
narrative.
I put in the description, we have the title for this show, but I put in
Oh
the
my
description for
gosh.
Facebook and our other things we're showing on, I put in there, nothing new under the sun. It's
When they say
these people
there's-
are not creative.
Right.
They have the same, and I'm not taking Dewey's side, or I'm not taking Truman's
right,
side.
right. I'm
It's-
certainly not taking the media side. Leonard says Truman was kept outside of Roosevelt's inner circle. Didn't even know about the atomic bomb until he became president. I did.
Well,
I did read
that's
that.
the narrative,
That's the narrative.
and but I would wonder about that.
But I don't know. I kind of think they kept him in the dark about a lot of things. That's why that writer said, was it even his choice, or Truman also, when he left office, the way that the storybooks write
But
about
that
him.
is in line with the whole, he didn't make the decision because it was
Right.
already made before he got in office.
Right. When Truman left office, the story is that he left poor and only $112 per month And actually,
Oh yeah, and
that's not true. He
and that's a good thing to bring up is that Truman
he
was
passed the pension,
Well,
the
he was-
Future Presidents Act that gave
yeah,
the
but he was out of office and he was messaging the Speaker of the House and so on, saying, "Hey, I'm not lobbying for this bill, but I'm lobbying for
Right.
this bill.
right.
I'm going to need this because if I'm barely going to be, I'm going to need assistance.
Right.
He's basically saying I'm going to be on welfare
Right.
if you don't pass this thing."
And then-
he was one of the top income earners in the country as president
Right.
leading up to that.
So
but
they
he had no money.
They try to paint him as like the accidental president. He was just your average, ordinary guy. So at that time, the president, before he got elected to office, the salary of the president was $75,000 a month, and then after he got into office, before he got into office, they passed it to 100,000.
It was 75,000
plus 50,000.
while he was president when he took over from Roosevelt.
Yeah.
So prior to re-election and when he got his own actual legitimate term, that's when they raised it to 100,000.
Okay, but they also got 50,000 in an expense
Like a
account.
special expense account.
But his tax records now show that they've released in the last,
You
I think, 20
few
years.
Yeah. No, less than that. It's not even 20 years.
It shows that the money that he got
He took the 50
tax
grand
free.
all 4 years.
He didn't pay taxes on them, and his
And now,
wife was setting them aside.
the first 2 years of his presidency, it wasn't taxable.
What is
And then Congress made it taxable his last 2 years, and he still didn't declare it. But he took them, and there were no controls on. You didn't have to say what you're spending on.
Right.
So each year he took the 50 grand, and then
Right.
this is 1951.
51, 50,
48
49.
to 52. So he took 200 grand
yeah.
and didn't account for it.
And then when he
And
left office,
this article thinks that he could have run for re-election. He could have, even though he had, because presidents can't serve more than 8 years, but it's
Right.
2 terms. But he took over from Roosevelt, so he was grandfathered in.
Right.
So he could have served 4 more years if he wanted.
Exactly.
He chose not to run for re-election, and that was the one with Ike, and I don't even know who Ike ran against. I haven't even looked at that.
Who did I run against? I don't even
That
know.
might be interesting to look at too.
But when he left office, he got a book advance, and I
Yeah.
think it was like
It was $600,000.
$600,000, but in our term, it would be like 6.6
6.6 million. Well, he also claimed to all the guys he was trying to get that bill passed that I only made 37 grand from this after taxes and expenses.
Yeah.
So, nostalgia. We covered it last year or earlier this year. It was last
Right.
year.
It was last year.
It was last year. So nostalgia comes from
Greek?
Swiss? It comes from Greek.
Oh, from
But
that.
it was a
Swiss
Swiss
Army.
doctor. He was a medical student who was looking at Swiss mercenaries.
Yeah.
And he made the word nostalgia from the Greek words nostos and algos, which nostos is homecoming, and algos is ache or pain,
Yeah.
longing, and so he came up with this term nostalgia. He started diagnosing these mercenaries with this. They had all these physical ailments.
It would be
They were away
diagnosed
from home.
with nostalgia.
And the best cure was to send them home. And then soldiers were being diagnosed with this up into World War I, World War II. They were diagnosed in the Civil War. But in that episode we did about nostalgia, me and Yvonne, we were looking at it. We found that there were about 2,500 Union soldiers that were diagnosed with nostalgia.
That is-
But we couldn't find any time where Confederates were diagnosed with
Right.
the same thing. And we
it was just strange.
just surmised that maybe it was because the Confederates were defending their homeland
home. And the
the
North.
Northerners, which some of them would have been Irish and German mercenaries.
Yeah.
Because I've read reports that Confederate prison, the prisons were horrible on both sides, North
Yeah.
and South, but Confederate prisoners would complain, or Confederate prison officers would complain that the Northern prisoners couldn't speak English. And so that was just an interesting
even
little
Russia.
tidbit.
Russia helped out.
Russia
the North.
helped
A
with
lot
the
of people don't
blockade.
know that. The Russians.
The Russian Tsar helped with the northern blockade of the Confederacy during the Civil War.
Most people don't know that.
And they had naval ships in New York Harbor and in going out
Well,
into the
Russia-
Atlantic. And
help
in
the
San
North
Francisco
win
harbor.
the war.
Yeah, Russia. I guess Russia's been interfering for
Yeah.
for a very long time.
It's kind of funny.
But nostalgia, we covered it too, and it goes in with this Truman article. I think he called it the politics of nostalgia.
Oh yeah.
And me and Yvonne
Good
in our episode talked about how nostalgia can be a good thing and a bad thing. It's like we said earlier, you can remember. People start to they remember good times, the when the press was good and it was.
The press was never
even,
good.
and it never was. And we talked about in our episode last year is that with nostalgia, it's good with, like, we mentioned our grandmother making homemade biscuits every night for dinner.
Yeah.
And so that's
real.
real.
That's
You
a
experienced
real-
it yourself. But there's a nostalgia that starts to happen in this world where you've been inundated with images on
You've
the
been
screen
programmed to remember a past that never was.
that wasn't there.
And it's this article. It's called. I don't know if you can. Yeah, you probably won't be able to see that, but. Oh well. Anyway, the Truman Show: How the 33rd President finagled his way to a post-White House fortune and created a damaging precedent. And within the body of that article, it says, hold on. It says. Yet the fact that it has taken more than 60 years for the story to come to light also tells a great deal about what could be called the politics of nostalgia, of the tendency of everyone, from professional historians to the public at large, to cast a sentimental haze around certain historical figures and periods when we assume honorable men ruled the land and America was still truly great. This tendency has produced a historical myth about Harry Truman that still has contemporary consequences as it continues to be deployed to rationalize the unjustifiable practice of showering millions of dollars per year of government benefits on our uniformly wealthy ex-presidents.
Yeah.
Now, forget the president, because what they're given, the money they're given to ex-president, pales in comparison to the foreign aid. Like the New Yorker's getting upset about that, but the politics of nostalgia. They use. I mean, commercial products use this, nostalgia to get you to buy a product. Politicians use it to get you to, put that blue and yellow flag up for the Ukraine.
Yeah.
They're selling you stories. Like I recently read this this book. I don't know if it's a book. I know you can buy it on Amazon. It's called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. Where now the warfare is that they shoot situations instead of bullets.
Yeah.
And if you look at Ukraine, COVID, monkeypox, the market,
but it's like
it's a situation,
a
and
whiplash thing, and
they
it's
just keep
constant.
shooting, and we go out there chase. It's like we're playing whack-a-mole, and we just keep chasing whatever situation they shoot out there, instead of just sitting back and looking at what's real in our lives and what's good, and building off of that.
And then knowing that it's with nostalgia, like we have with our grandmother making the homemade biscuits for dinner every night.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
And we always had grape jelly with them and butter and stuff, and it's just so good. And then I juxtapose that with Walter Cronkite. That he just spoke the news, and like with the article we just read, where the guy was saying, we surgically removed our political biases or whatever.
Right.
I'm like, that's bullshit.
And truthfully, we can't. Like Lou and I have a set of biases that are, biased.
And we've got to figure out how to check that.
Yeah.
And we've got to fight it every day.
Well, what you can do is we're all blessed with a discernment, a third eye, where you can.
And we're supposed to pray. Proverbs says we're supposed to pray for discernment.
Right.
Because that is a tool we're given, but it needs to be developed. And that's why sometimes we look at the Wikipedia version of events for these episodes, because I want to see what they're bragging about.
Now that since we've been doing this, now I love going to Wikipedia because I can really learn so much from it, not because of how they write it, but how they don't write it.
I didn't see it. We're not used to looking at the chat. Okay. Ike defeated Adlai Stevenson.
Adlai Stevenson. Oh, yeah. See, I'm forgetting Adlai Stevenson, and then what was the other guy that resigned? Oh, Spiro Agnew. They have these kind of neat names.
Uh-huh.
The Manhattan Project and the B-29, which was the delivery plane for the bomb. Well, see, Lou and I.
Well, there was two different. Enola Gay was one maybe B-29
Enola
was
Gay?
for both. Enola Gay was one of the planes.
Yeah,
Was I don't know. Was it for both bombings?
right. And Lou and I
But
happened to wonder
that's
if
a
those
whole-
were actually
That's a whole other episode about
nuclear
atomic
weapons,
bombs.
because those cities in Hiroshima and
Nagasaki.
were not nearly as
They were not in the
destroyed
top 10 of destroyed
as
cities
Dresden.
in Japan. No, not even in Japan.
Yeah.
Tokyo was in the top, but just conventional weapons in Japan, the top 10 were conventional weapons, destroyed cities in
They
Japan.
can tell you that they dropped the nuclear weapons and control the news with the one photographer that was allowed in, and if somebody else
Yeah.
published photos, they would be jailed. There's something about all of that that doesn't make sense to me, but that's a whole nother stream.
Well, and a little tidbit, there was this war council that Japan had, and I think Tojo was still in it at the end.
Yeah.
After Hiroshima, they did not meet. This war cabinet
Oh,
would
yeah.
get with the Emperor of Japan and make these crucial, huge, big umbrella, plans for the country about what was going on with the war. They did not meet after Hiroshima bombing.
Right.
They met the day after Nagasaki, but that was also the same time where Russia invaded Manchuria. And so I would posit that, and other people have before me, is that Japan surrendered because Russia was coming over the border with a couple million troops.
Right.
Because they both were, they even though they were fighting in other parts of the world against different allies, Russia and Japan stayed in a stalemate. Yeah, Enola Gay dropped Hiroshima.
And
Boxcar dropped Nagasaki. So Russia and Japan stayed in a stalemate in the East. They just watched each other. They didn't fight each other.
That's some serious
And then,
thunder.
with the Lend-Lease stuff, America was sending all these tons of supplies to Russia. Food and weapons and fuel and just all kinds of shit.
Yeah. Oh, that's
And-
a whole nother thing. The
and-
money that was involved in that.
Part of a lot of the shipments would go in the North Atlantic and then go over Norway, Sweden, and into, I think it's Murmansk.
Yeah.
But Vladivostok was another important port in the Pacific, and the Japanese Navy never attacked American ships supplying the Soviet Union with what it's like there was an agreement.
Yeah. Which makes sense if you think about Pearl Harbor, that Roosevelt knew ahead of time, and he didn't stop it when that one.
But there was
general-
just a whole nother level of stuff going there
right.
that we can't know.
So back to the. Are you done with nostalgia, or you have more on nostalgia?
No, I think
Okay.
we
The-
could talk about it forever.
Back
but
to the idea that the Truman Show and
Yeah.
who's actually running things. So an interesting tidbit about Biden's Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. His great grandfather was named Mayor. I think that's how you say Mayor, Meir Blinken. He was born and raised in Ukraine. He was educated in business in Kiev, and now he's Biden's Secretary of State.
And just a side note, I will always say it. I will
Kiev.
always call it
It's
Kiev.
Kyiv. Yeah, they
Because
started.
I never heard Kiev in my life until this shit started.
Right.
And I
And
think it
it's
started with
everybody.
Biden.
And it's everybody. It's the media. It's like all at once. They all receive their talking points. But so anyway, so that's the current Secretary of State's great grandfather's background in Ukraine, and that that goes to our idea that Biden's not running things. Now, do I think Anthony Blinken's running things?
Yeah, see, I
No.
don't think he's a Kissinger to Nixon.
No.
Because here's the thing with that. We also believe that this world, it devolves. It
Yeah,
doesn't get
yeah.
better. Technology advances and all this stuff happens.
Well, it
but
devolves
actually,
until there's a reset.
But we devolve.
Yeah.
We're getting worse. And I think I
Today's
really
current
think
crop.
that this current crop of
Shadow
people,
government or deep
whatever you want to
state.
call it, the powers that be, whatever you want to call it, they're not as good as they used to be in the 70s
Right.
or the 80s. Because I think Kissinger is a monster,
Yeah.
but he would run circles around Blinken
Definitely.
or Condoleezza Rice
Yeah.
or John Kerry,
Right.
Obama's
Oh,
second
forget he was the
Secretary of State. He would run circles around him, but
Right.
it would be evil circles.
Right.
So even the bad, everything devolves. A lot of it devolves. Not individuals out here in the world, but these guys are not as good as they used to be.
Right. And Kissinger was involved in Gerald Ford. He might have been an advisor and not for Gerald Ford, but he was Nixon's. Was he Secretary of State?
He was
or
the
NSA?
Secretary of State.
And then I think
What?
he was
He
involved
started-
in George H. Bush. He was I don't know what all
I'm sure
his
he
titles
was. I'm
were.
sure he was.
But he was also involved with
Talked to
George W. And I don't know if he had anything to do with Bill Clinton. But I do know that Obama met with him, and then so did Trump.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's just like the thing we played at the beginning of the video. Kennedy calling Truman up.
Yeah.
And he went, oh yeah. And you hear it's a 2-minute video, and it's a conversation between Kennedy calling Truman and giving him an update of what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
You're on the right track. You're doing good, man. I'm like, okay, thanks. Great talking to you. And I'm like, there was nothing. There's nothing.
There was no substance there. It was just theater. But, like in Nixon with Kissinger, Kissinger and Alexander Haig were untouched in that whole Watergate scandal, which leads me to believe they
And then
were,
Alexander Haig goes on in the Reagan administration.
They were the handler. They were the...
Alexander Haig is Secretary of... is he Secretary of State with Reagan?
Oh,
I think he was Secretary of State.
Yeah. I forgot about Reagan's. But it's just something we want you to think about. Biden's not president, we know that. And Trump, whether he was in on it or he was a puppet or he didn't know, somebody was running things behind him, and we think it goes back a long way. And
I do think Trump probably had a combination, and it was Jared Kushner was the inside
I definitely
man.
think Jared Kushner is one a handler.
But Mike Pompeo comes from CIA and becomes Secretary of State.
Well, wait a minute. George H. Bush was the head of CIA.
He was head of
Goes on to
CIA.
become VP and then president. So.
And that was in the 70s.
Right.
So
it's just something fun to look at. That when you see the news stories and you see what's going on in Ukraine.
And even with our hypothesis that Secretaries of State might be the ones who are running the show, because they're like even diehard Biden supporters right now. I would bet money half of them don't know who the Secretary of State is.
Right.
And what a perfect place for somebody to hide and do stuff.
Right.
And I would even with that I would say they're answering to somebody else too that we don't even know who.
Right.
But that's okay because they're doing their shit. We're gonna do our shit in our world.
Well,
So-
you know how this is inverse world, and it's like the opposite of what they tell us. And we were reading about how the Secretary of State is considered like a consolation prize.
Yeah.
So when I read that,
Sometimes it is,
Yeah.
but then sometimes it's on purpose.
Right.
It's like, and now with Hillary, it might have been a combination of consolation and we're going to get you in there because
Right.
for Obama to appoint her as the Secretary of State, I mean, she's fourth in line to the presidency if something
Right.
happens.
Mhm.
And so they ran a brutal campaign against each other. I mean,
Right.
if it had been opposite parties,
They sure did.
if it had been opposite parties, the media would have called her a huge racist and
Right.
gone off on her.
Well,
So
just back to we'll wrap it up with this. Back to the idea that there's that the president's not really running things. They don't have the power, and Lou and I think it's the Secretary of State. Just the fact that in 1886, it used to be they were third in line, and I don't know if it was 1886 that it was changed, or if it was in 1792.
yeah,
I can't remember what happened, but anyway, at some point in our history, the Secretary of State was the third in line, and then it got changed to the Senate pro tempore, but
yeah.
then it got changed to the Speaker of the House, third, and then the Senate, and then the Secretary of State.
Yeah.
So, anyway, it's the Truman Show. We're watching some form of the Truman Show mixed with the
And-
Matrix.
You know, we're about finished, but I drive a truck for a living now during the week, and I'm on the road, and before I even got on the road, I stopped watching news. I stopped. Whether I used to be Fox, I used to read the Wall Street Journal religiously. That was my thing. I used to love Wall Street Journal because its motto was "free markets, free people," and I was like, it was so simple and so sure. But over 10 years ago, I started seeing in the editorials. I'm like, what the? Are you fucking kidding me? And then it's even worse now when I see tidbits. But I don't look at news anymore.
Right.
But I I'll stop at truck stop. A lot of times I'm at a Denny's for dinner at night, and I'll sit at the counter and they'll have the TVs on. And every once in a while, a lot of times now they have the Weather Channel, which is a bullshit channel, but at least it's not. At least I can just like look at radar and stuff and see where rain's coming. But I saw the other night, and it was it Tucker? It was Tucker Carlson, and the sound wasn't on. They had the captions on, and I was just like, this is the best comedy. It's, if you can look at it, if you can step back and just relax and just look at it like that, and I'm glad it wasn't CNN, but even with Fox, it's the same.
It's the same.
No, it was Hannity.
Oh, gosh.
Because when I walked in and I sat down, he had Dr. Oz on, and the caption said, Dr. Oz updates us on campaign numbers or the primary numbers. I'm like, oh, he's your independent analyst on what's happening with the election. But I couldn't hear it, which was awesome. And I could just, every once in a while, look up and see the closed captions, and then sometimes look at my phone and check some stuff. And I was looking at the Weather Channel on the other side. But it was just looking at it as a comedy. It's kind of a poorly written comedy, but sometimes there's gems that you can see.
Yeah.
And so I would say look at it like that. Is all the news that you know, the primary guys, and the one we read earlier where he wanted us to how was it, respected, and what was the word?
Deference.
The proper
respect.
deference and respect. I'm like, that goes back into the 60s where everybody thought the news was still good, was decent. So that's that fake nostalgia.
Yeah.
So look at it as a comedy show and get a good laugh.
Yeah, because they feed off of your fear and your demoralization and your outrage.
Yeah.
So if you don't give them that, I don't know how it all works.
And I think it's like, I think Owen said one time, is like when the devil can't stand when you laugh at him.
Yeah.
And so if you're laughing at those narratives, I think that could go. If more people just did that.
So when you look at Biden, he's not he's not running anything. But think of it as a comedy show, like it's an SNL skit. Like, okay, and
not even a SNL sucks now, but
yeah. When SNL was
skit.
good, that's another story. But
well, we can end with, we're going to start ending always with, we say it. We don't mean it to sound doom and gloom, but at the end, our battle is not against the physical; it's spiritual.
Right.
We're not fighting flesh and blood.
Right. And we have power over the dark forces of this world. So.
And actually, and if we realize that when the Bible says "fear not" so much in the Old and New Testament, over and over again, I don't know how many times, but over and over, fear not, fear not.
Right.
And if you actually can embody that, and I still struggle with it sometimes because I have a son that's graduating this week, and I have 2 other kids, and I sometimes look in the future and I have that hint of fear come in. So, but just take that to heart, fear not, because when you do, the devil really doesn't have any power. His power is our appetites. I really believe that.
Well,
and if we can work to control our appetites, that he has and then laugh at him. Just laugh at him.
The peace that passes all understanding comes in when you lose that fear, when you do not fear. So.
And I feel that sometimes.
Yeah.
Within I'm in the physical, and it's going to trap me sometimes, and I gotta punch out of it.
Right.
Leonard's right.
Stay
away from that propaganda.
Yeah. So if you watch the news, you're just.
But if you're going to see it. If you're going to see it, because
Put it on.
sometimes you'll see it, just go. Because I was sitting at that counter, and if somebody I don't know if somebody was watching me from a distance and like, that guy's nuts, because I was just like, every once in a while I'd look up and I'd go, just a small, not a loud laugh, but I would just laugh.
Right.
And like, so if you do see that propaganda, just kind of, pray for discernment every day, and then when you see it, just laugh at it.
Yeah. Then it has no power. So, thank you for listening.
Well, and let's set up for next month, because we wanted to do it last year, and timing with me on the road and stuff, we didn't make it happen. It would have been a 40-year anniversary.
Yeah.
We're going to, I don't know how we'll title it, but it's going to be like our origins and why we think what we think. It's going to be about family stuff and where we came from, and it's going to be, I think it'll be interesting for some folks, and it's just going to be a. I think we might just call it Origins or I
Right.
don't know.
It's going to,
But
Ides is on June 13th, and Lou and I are actually from Texas. We left Texas on June 13th, 1981, and there's an interesting story behind that.
we escaped in the middle of the night from a dad that was an asshole.
It was more
but
than
it was,
an asshole.
Yeah. But it was our grandparents that saved us that night,
Yeah.
and we're totally grateful for that. And we also realized that other people didn't have that safety net.
Right.
And so it's gonna kind of explain how it shapes how we think about things today, and how, for me, it's gonna shape how, or explain how I can let go of so many things I believed
Right.
before, because we'll get into it next month.
Yeah. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next month.
Next Ides, hopefully on the Ides.
Yeah.